This conference will now be recorded.
Lovely. So thank you, Anthony. If we could have the same kind of thing from you, i.e. who you are, your organisation, and the relevance of the just or the meaning of the just transition for you.
Absolutely, yes. Great to be with you all. I know the technical delay gave you all a couple extra minutes to hear from Allison, which is always great, and it gave me a couple extra minutes to find some more lighting for the set here in San Francisco, because it is quite early, but I also have coffee, so we'll be all set. My name's Anthony Toppy. I'm a senior manager on the company network team at Ceres. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit based in Boston and San Francisco in the US. We've been working with companies and investors on sustainability, integration into business and financial markets, capital market systems for 30 years now. I specifically work within our company network team, meaning we work with companies on a one-on-one basis on their sustainability strategy. And when we say sustainability, we take a broad definition to include climate change, natural resource conservation and water, all the way through to sustainable supply chains and human rights as the kind of performative elements of sustainability. We also look at the integral parts of governance, disclosure, and stakeholder engagement as the real accountability mechanisms to ensuring sustainability is deeply integrated into the business. For just transition, I couldn't agree more with Allison in terms of it being a really timely conversation. It's a term that's been around for a long time, but it has kind of resurfaced into the sustainability vernacular, and I think a lot of folks are eager to unpack what it means. For Ceres specifically, I think we've used it most recently and most strongly in terms of the transition to a clean energy economy, particularly thinking about the job transition for workers in the oil and gas sector, what it means for them to be engaged in a renewable energy economy, and also the communities around oil and gas facilities. But I think as Allison was pointing out, it's a much broader concept than that. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation here today to think about what it means in practice for other sectors beyond just energy. Thinking about the food and agriculture sector. If we have laborers who are still responsible for hand picking our fruits and vegetables, particularly thinking about the fruits and nuts that are grown here in California, what does it mean for a just transition for those workers where days are hotter, the weather is more volatile? How do we ensure that their jobs are decent and well-paying despite the changing climate? So really looking forward to exploring how climate change as a disruptive risk to all different types of work, all different types of labor markets can be addressed through the private sector and made sure that decent jobs are the outcome.
Brilliant, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, very lucky to have you both on the line. Thank you very, very much. So you've both touched on the fact that a just transition is a lot of different things, and it's gaining traction now. Why do you think there has been a more general move from the E of ESG, which obviously has taken a massive prevalence in the past, to the S side of the ESG? Alison, should we go to you first?
I think the point of both the title and what Anthony has just said is really important. We shouldn't be looking at one leg of the stool without the others. And the E and the S and the G go together. And the reality is that the S has kind of been the poor country cousin for a very long time. Environmental disclosure, environmental standards have been understood in terms of their materiality, as Anthony says, in certain industries, particularly energy, fossil fuels, energy production, distribution, and ownership. And governance, of course, partly because of a legalistic framework in which we live, has long been, a key priority for responsible businesses. And the S, we'll just deal with that later. Well, it's time. And so I think, we're in the union movement, we're often talking about it's the L in the S, in the ESG. It's the labor risks that people have not necessarily paid so much attention to unless there's been some scandal, some television expose, child labor, forced labor, migrant workers in Qatar, etc. And it's like, this is not news, guys. Now we have investors and companies who are actually dealing with what it is to be a responsible business, what it is to be a sustainable business in all its elements. Not just the financial sustainability of the company, but indeed its ecological, environmental sustainability, its social sustainability. What is the purpose of the company? And that's becoming kind of cachet now for many companies, even CFOs and CIOs, to be talking about, is our company purposeful? Well, you know, it was really kind of up to the 80s where that was not a debate. In the 1980s, unsurprisingly little in the American context, when dear President Ronald Reagan kind of made it so hard for trade unions to represent workers, all of these things kind of got thrown out, baby with the bathwater, you know? And so in terms of where I sit at a global level, to notice where governments and companies actually value a social dialogue, value a social contract. There is a conversation now, even in the World Economic Forum, where they're talking about a new social contract. And for us, this is about actually realizing that the primacy of shareholders, and indeed, if your company or investment body is looking at shareholder engagement, that's super important. But the primacy of shareholders is also kind of a thing of the past, right? If you're really seriously engaging with stakeholders, that includes your workforce. It's not just a numbers game. It's not just a disclosure about statistics on the number of workers who are members of a union or not, those who have access to freedom of association or not. Union access, whether you're a worker in a garment factory in Bangladesh, whether you're a migrant worker working in the farms of Southern California, or whether you're a healthcare worker working in a private or public health facility, whether you can join a union, whether you can have your voice represented, whether you can take on really bad practices or not sufficiently safe practices in your workplace is really important. And that's about a dialogue. That's about being represented. And that's what unions do. So in many, many industrial relations environments, there's been this terribly confrontational kind of approach to trade unions. You know, we're always the troublemakers, but no, we're the ones who say, we've got a problem here. Can we sort this? And, you know, through various different mechanisms to actually address a serious long-term vision of dealing with those problems is what we see as patient capital, right? That's what we see the role of the investor to be, raising those questions, asking for those solutions, demanding timelines and transparency and transitional plans. And that's really what a just transition is. It's a transition that delivers greater justice, and that's both in terms of climate, environment, the things that Anthony lists there, but it's also in terms of what kind of workplace practices are being practiced and where we can actually raise the bar for better practices that will mean better business outcomes and more sustainable companies.
Yeah, and just to pick up on one of Alison's last points there about timelines, I think that's one of the big differentiators between why the S issues have risen to prominence more recently. When we think of the environmental issues, when we think of the impacts of climate change, we've typically thought about the physical impacts to tangible assets, to the property, plants, and equipment, right? The volatile, increasingly volatile and destructive natural disaster events, flooding, you know, impacts to physical assets are going to happen over the next few decades. And we're seeing companies step up to the plate to set ambitious targets to reduce their contribution to the impacts of climate change. For the S issues, though, we're seeing that timeline is getting shorter and shorter, and is here now. If we think about some of the more recent examples around an engaged workforce, employee loyalty, the S issues of tech companies developing products that employees themselves are saying, I don't want to be a part of this. This isn't something that I signed up for. And these aren't the type of things that I want to work on because I know this product is going to have negative human rights impacts. If you're a company that's not listening to your employees in that way, you've got an S issue on your hands, and that's going to affect your ability to attract and retain that talented workforce. Same thing when your workforce sees that there's mistreatment of workers in global supply chains. And that's nothing to say of the calls for racial justice in the United States, which for us here at Ceres is very front of mind of the purpose of companies to address racial justice issues. If you've got a diversity and inclusion program that kind of says one thing, but then reports come out that you're actually doing another thing, that's an S issue as well. And those impacts are here today. So I think to Alice's point around timelines, that's why maybe the S issues are rising up on the agenda as well, is because companies are having to grapple with these things on a weekly basis because there's a lot coming at them. That's not to say that, again, on the advocacy side, we don't want to minimize the importance of the environmental issues. We're going to continue to push both. But I think the planning and the foresight that is needed to address these S issues is really something companies need to consider, because they're only going to become more serious. They're only going to become more complex to untangle as we continue to come out of the COVID-19 crisis as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The timeline has become incredibly contracted over the past few months, and I think rightly so that it's really shone a global spotlight on what all these big companies are doing and the practices they had in place initially, the policies and practices they had to help look after their staff, or the distinct lack thereof, and now hopefully those any measures they have put in place, hopefully they will carry through, but we will see. What do you see as the current appetite for companies and all stakeholders prioritizing workforce and social issues and human rights due diligence in particular? That's kind of the hot topic in Europe at the moment. What do you think on that side of things, Alison?
Well, for those who live outside of the EU, you may not be aware, but the European Commission announced that in 2021 they will be developing draft legislation, I understand by January 2021, which in these COVID times might feel like 500 years away, but it's actually only 6 months away, that for sure, taking into account risk is a really important part of a business operation, and that now it will be mandatory. So mandatory due diligence to actually have an assessment of risk, a plan around how to deal with that risk, and a stakeholder engagement process to ensure that that is holistic and sufficient to actually anticipate risk. So we see actually that just transition, whilst that's not being spoken about in the same kind of silo because people work in different silos, but what we see is that both the disruption that COVID-19 has exposed in terms of lack of business planning ahead, beyond, if you like, the 3-month liquidity plans that many companies have really shown they don't have a plan beyond that. And so the kind of just-in-time management or reliance on, weekly and monthly cash flow, if you like, is no longer sustainable. Then businesses are at risk. And for investors, the anticipation of how companies will deal with risk, having plans to anticipate the future, is really essential. And we would say that, very often in the investor world, you hear terms like stranded assets. Well, any investment being made now is a potentially stranded asset, whether you call it green, gray, brown, etc. It's very often being spoken about in terms of clean energy and renewable energy, as Anthony was pointing out. But actually, stranded assets are any assets, any investment in your technology platforms, any investment in your workforce. People and communities will be stranded if we don't have a view to how business is being conducted and where it is being conducted and under what terms it's being conducted. So the mandatory due diligence framing from a union perspective is very welcome, and it's really necessary to actually help businesses join the dots and help policymakers join the dots. So whilst it's being spoken in terms of human rights and labour rights and standards and practices, it is actually about good business practices. And that is something that, you know, has been debated for a number of years, particularly in Europe, whether that needs to be mandatory or voluntary. That debate was held in Germany over the last couple of years. And we see is not only in France the vigilance law being practiced, but many member states in the EU taking that on, and now the EU itself saying this is necessary. And as far as that impacts the global economy, this is now a global conversation. So investors and businesses across the world, in other regions, in Latin America, in Northern America, the Americas, in Asia Pacific, Australia, I know others in my home country being on the call here, I want to call out to, you know, Australia is quite far behind on discussions around due diligence practices. And so the reality about sustainability is now connecting the dots between those different elements. And so transparency in both practice and in reporting is now a foundation that is acknowledged as being really important in practice.
Yeah, and just to pick up on first the geographic differences that Alison is calling out, totally agree with that. We've been in conversations with companies where we introduced the topic of human rights due diligence, asking them to kind of explain the overall process, looking across their value chain to identify salient human rights issues, and we kind of get one of two responses. One is that, well, human rights, that's in our supply chain report. That's where that is. That's where that issue shows up, and it's a reluctance to acknowledge that human rights and the human rights due diligence process are going to surface issues across your value chain. In the way you treat your own workers and the work environment you provide in your direct operations, in the way that your product is used, in the way that you engage communities around your facilities as well. So the idea that human rights are just supply chain issues is already something that we're having to deal with in the US. And I think mandatory human rights due diligence legislation coming out of the EU would send a big signal to US-based companies that they need to get ahead of this now, before they're going to be put back in a place of trying to demonstrate compliance, which we know that's the second response that we get is, what's your human rights strategy? Oh, well, we comply with all local laws. It's like, well, we know in the US specifically, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's exactly right. Just until a couple of weeks ago, it was completely legal to fire someone for their sexual orientation. But we as Ceres wouldn't say that that's necessarily right. Like, we would want companies to have a policy going beyond that, saying that we don't discriminate against their employees and they'll protect their employees regardless of their sexual orientation, race, and gender. And so the human rights due diligence process is something that's going to help companies identify where those blind spots are, where they don't have that transparency into the way that they're potentially negatively impacting folks. And that's something I think investors are starting to grasp, and we've seen a lot of support for it. As you can imagine, there are a lot of the more forward-thinking European investors as well. So looking forward to what comes out of the EU and how that will translate to the US market. I think the other piece to think about is just the way that it translates to different companies. You know, I know WDI has had sessions with different companies about the process and the actual implementing of human rights due diligence, and we've done the same thing with the companies we work with here at Ceres. And there's real practical challenges with where do I start, what issues do I focus on. It's completely legitimate concerns, especially with companies of hundreds of thousands of people. But I think the things that we always focus on is don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. Start having these conversations. Reach out to the organizations you do know and that you do have relationships with, and at least get them going. Find ways to engage affected rights holders now so that you can at least build the infrastructure internally so that when things are mandated, when there are formal regulations around this process, you've got the internal capital to really make it a formal process and to start identifying the issues that might not be material now in the traditional sense, but will become material very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything you said rings true of what we hear from companies as well. It's so tricky to work out exactly what they need to be doing, and no one really knows the right answer, but it's absolutely getting started. That's the crucial part. And I think the way the WDI looks at it is essentially business resilience. Unless you are assessing throughout your value chain where risks to human rights sit, then you're in all kinds of trouble, no doubt, later down the line. And we have actually introduced for this year for 2020. A couple of questions around business resiliency, mainly, in the wake of COVID, but they'll be carried forward to ask about that aspect of the company and how they do business. So looking at things slightly differently then, what do you think COVID has done for companies' environmental agendas and their reporting? And what in particular are you hearing from your networks? Are you getting anything from them that's talking about the impacts? Anthony, should we go to you first?
Sure, yeah. So I think the main challenge right now is companies trying to understand, is COVID and global pandemics more broadly another issue I have to report on? Do we now have to have a strategy and specifically disclose what we're going to do, God forbid this happens again, or we continue to struggle with this long term, versus trying to understand the challenges that this has surfaced, the weaknesses in the human rights management approach that this has surfaced, and learning from it and integrating the solutions there. In the vein of talking about human rights due diligence and identifying salient human rights issues, I don't think we, as CERES, would argue that now managing the impacts of global pandemics should start popping up in folks' sustainability reports, but we should start seeing an increase in a deeper focus on health and safety, a deeper focus on employee benefits. What percentage of your employees actually have access? Are you providing healthcare to? What percentage of your contract workers have access to healthcare if you're not providing it yourselves as well? So I don't think it's augmenting their agenda so much, but there is a struggle to figure out how to fit this in within existing strategies in a meaningful and credible way so that investors know the company is prepared, again, God forbid something like this happens again. I think that's where we would want to see companies go as well. We don't necessarily need to see additional issues on the list, but a more meaningful and nuanced understanding of how these issues are actually impacting people, and then how that translates to an impact on the business as well.
Yeah, I think it's the embedding that's key, isn't it? We want to make sure that this does actually lead to concrete, long-lasting change. I think you're absolutely right. Alison, I don't know if you have anything that you would. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Rosie, I think building on what Anthony said. Sorry, I was used to managing my own mute. Thank you for managing me too. Okay, building on what Anthony says, I think from what we see, I'm emphasizing how this is nothing new. What COVID-19 has exposed is the intersection and the interconnectedness of these various crises, of inequality, of workers who are now understood and seen to be essential workers, actually providing essential services and goods in the economy, being often the lowest paid, very often disproportionately women of color or migrant workers, etc. And it's nothing new to say this has been a long time, decades long, in some cases centuries long, inequality that has never been addressed seriously. Well, now's the time. Or what are the consequences of that? And so, we have a choice as a society, we have choices as companies and as investors, and indeed as trade unions. And so I would say that in addition to what Anthony rightly points out, the business operations very often in a climate responsive context, people say no more business as usual. Well, hello, we're still in a business as usual world. And the reality is that the disruption that COVID-19 has provided, not only in terms of the health and the ability of people to conduct their work, but for businesses to rely on their own production facilities, where supply is coming from, how logistics and transport are being managed, where sales are coming from. Like literally that's now, as Anthony says, a daily analysis, not something that's done on a monthly or 3-monthly basis any longer. So business as usual has been disrupted. And some companies are up for that and some are not. And some are going to go out of business, and many are going to go out of business, actually. The economic impact of this has not yet been at force globally. despite, you know, more people being unemployed in the United States within a 2-week period, this more than what happened in, you know, the Great Depression back in 1929. Sorry, the math, the numbers. In 1929, like that is a massive impact, and yet there has not been the floor of social protection in the United States, for example, around access to unpaid leave, leave for the purposes of being sick, or for carers leave, or in some countries being called calls for pandemic leave. If you don't have access to leave, you're going to go to work whether you're sick or not, if you have to support your family. And that is a huge, huge risk to the local economy, the global economy, and whether that's being seen as, in some cases, within cities or states or countries, but has a global impact that we have those kinds of infection rates in places like meat plants or poultry processing plants. It's not only about how transition is being planned for, but what are the underpinnings of that in terms of economic and social policy. I'm a social wonk in this conversation, right? But it really is about having the connections between those things be really clear. And so I want to go back to before the recording, when I was introducing the Paris Agreement and the ILO guidelines, because for those who missed it or who are listening later, the ILO guidelines back in 2015 for a just transition towards environmentally sound economies and societies for all is a framework that companies, investors of all kinds, small and medium-sized enterprises, multinationals, those with extensive or very shallow supply chains, can use as a tool. It's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. We're not sending men and women to the moon in this process. We're actually saying there is sound work that people have been working on, and there's a foundation for guidance on that. And it's very generic, if you like. It can be applied in any kind of business setting. But one of the elements of guidance, which was I agreed to negotiate the terms of it agreed between workers' representatives, unions, employers at the ILO, and with governments through the labor ministries or labor and employment ministries. And one of the framings of that is really fundamental, but it's kind of necessary to point out. Governments and social partners should, I don't recall this, so I'm reading now, provide assistance to management and workers in transitioning business operations away from high carbon, high polluting and resource intensive operations. Such support should include technology transfer mechanisms on favorable terms that requires stakeholder engagement. As mutually agreed, that requires agreement making. Some would call them collective bargaining agreements, as well as support for innovation and good practices to facilitate the just transition to environmentally sustainable economies. That's actually what we need. That's clearly, as a result of COVID-19, has been exposed where that's happening and where it's not happening. And it's not happening in way too many workplaces, in way too many industries, and in way too many local and national economies. So the process of reporting that is both a company responsibility and one where transparency is not about shaming anybody or saying anybody's not doing it sufficiently. No one's doing it sufficiently. So let's raise the bar and let's actually have investors engage in that kind of conversation about not only what it will take and how that will be resourced and who's going to pay for it, but actually who's engaged and how quickly do we need to do that. That is not something that some federal authority can mandate or impose. Like, what timeline is necessary for this company to transition? What timeline is necessary for our local economy to have investment that delivers quality jobs and delivers aggregate demand, we call it, as we economists say, you know, like having the capacity for local economies to operate or to reboot or to reset after a lockdown. That's been as necessary before COVID-19 as it is now, but it seems just to be a little bit more urgent. And we say it's really urgent to save the planet, to save humanity, and to actually build businesses that can survive and prosper. And as I said before the recording started, to move from this concept of where we are in the intersection of crises to a recovery process. Whoever is engaged in income support, medical support, repurposing global supply chains, reshoring, onshoring, what does it mean for business practices and across the supply and value chains? And what does it mean, therefore, for resilience? And that's where we want to head to. And that's what we need to do now. It's urgent. It can't wait.
And Rosie, can I actually follow up on that? And actually, I want to ask Alison another question based on something she was saying. I think one of the silver linings of all of this, I don't know, it might be too early to call it out, but I'll call it a silver lining, at least within the US, is, and it could also be because we're in an election year, the window of policies that it's now acceptable to discuss, the policies that are on the table has shifted so quickly. We're hearing more and more about universal basic income, the impact of not having paid maternity and paternity leave is starker than ever. The role of having workers represented on corporate boards is something that's been put out by both political candidates and think tanks. So I wonder, what's the role of companies that are a little further removed from some of the carbon and consumption intensive sectors, right? So that aren't, in direct manufacturing or in oil and gas, to advocate for what you're talking about to get to more sustainable and green jobs. I think there's sometimes a perception of, well, we've got our own GHG footprint under control and we just have offices and we're, service providers. But couldn't you make an argument that some of the infrastructure and the policies that we're talking about here that are going to be necessary to realize that clean energy economy, necessary to realize that just transition, they've got to find their avenue and use their corporate voice to advocate for those as well. Is there a space for those types of companies in advocating for the things you're talking about when they're, maybe one or two sectors removed from both the environmental and social impact of things?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Yeah. So absolutely, it is time now not to put the light under the bushel, right? It's time to come out. It's time to come out, people who believe this. It is time to be seen as the real economy actors. And that's not just in energy. Of course, energy has been an important entry point into really addressing renewable and circular economies. But the companies that are investing in infrastructure, and we would say investing in green and infrastructure is really important, whether that's in transport, urban planning. Very often it's cities and municipalities who are looking at where they're investing right now. It's in construction, it's in retrofitting, it's in food and agricultural supply chains, it's in water supply, right? It's in all services. I know there are a number of people on the call who live in the world of the health sector, and we're now looking at what does it mean to have genuinely sustainable infrastructure in care. The care economy, investing in care is so important. And this has been something that, governments, because of austerity measures and the impact of international financial institutions saying, don't go there, then, lack of investment in public health, in public infrastructure has been something of the last 20 to 30 years. Well, it's time to come out, investors, and say, what is it that's going to actually is required by society and what is going to bring good returns. As trade unions, we are very interested in what the returns for pension funds is about, but we are not blinded by the fact that that cannot be on a short-term basis. We've always talked about patient capital, about long-term returns, about what it means for returns, for security, for decent work, and investing in companies that will invest in decent job creation. So for the international trade union movement, our demands are actually sixfold around investment right now. One is invest in job creation, invest in decent work. That means good jobs, that means union jobs, that means sound economic factors around wages, sick pay, unemployment benefits, etc. Like really, it's time to address what works and not just race to the bottom. There's a lot of that, and there will be a lot of that. But those companies are not going to survive longer term. The model of business has shifted. If no one's paid attention, in the last 3 months, the model of business has shifted. And so investment in industry policy or industrialization, you know, I mentioned before, it's sometimes reindustrialization in some areas. It's repurposing. A lot of companies are now looking at not just where do we make our garments for, you know, health sector workers' uniforms or masks. It's actually repurposing of the entire manufacturing supply chain. That means reshoring and onshoring, and the shape and the scope and the depth of supply chains is radically up for transition. So when we talk about industrial transformation, this is actually what we're talking about. So this is happening, whether, you know, people acknowledge it to the extent of how they engage in it, but it's happening. So the engagement of investment in what I call green enabling infrastructure. There is such a need for huge physical and social infrastructure investments. Where do asset managers see their role in that, and how do they engage in that? But investing indeed in social protection. And Anthony, in the union movement, we have a different relationship to universal basic income. That's a very loaded term for most people. That may be indeed what we get, but that is not sufficient. You know, the income replacement is for sure clearly needed to keep economies going. That's not a question. And in places like Spain, for example, they're really looking at that. But it's actually within a much bigger package, and that would be called universal social protection. And so around that, it is about access to health care. It is about access to maternity provisions or paternity leave. It is about support for child protection. It's about social protection covers also housing and access to water and sanitation. But it's also then number 5 on my list is investment in care. I mentioned that already, and so clear in terms of elderly care. The number of people who have died in elderly care homes in many developed countries is just tragic. And the lack of access to support, to decent working conditions and facilities and care is clearly something that is now in the front of many people, government and investors' minds. And lastly, investment in ecological recovery. So yeah, for sure, that's, you know, jobs rich, that's green jobs, but it's also the climate multiplier of investment in jobs, which is beyond renewable energy, but indeed in all sectors. And it's just so clear that so much of our lands, our forests, our agricultural lands, the way in which commercial agriculture is and fishing is undertaken, then, you know, there's investment in oceans, in ecological recovery across the board. And there's 6 big areas where investors should be really looking at where are our returns, where are our members' interests, but, you know, where are we going to make a difference here, and where are we going to actually contribute to long-term sustainability? Thanks.
I think you're absolutely right. It's going to take a bit of time, but it's already happening, and people need to make those changes. I just want to hark back very quickly to a point you made earlier, Alison, that don't wait to be perfect and do get started. I think that's something we hear a lot from companies, is they're a bit nervous about reporting data through the WDI until they have a whole complete data set, and our investors are, you know, very keen that actually they just submit something and show that they're engaging with the issues as much as they can, and that they're being as transparent as they possibly can. Very well. We'll stop in a minute for questions. We've had a couple come through, so do please carry on sending them. But Anthony, I just wanted to go back to what you said. What do you think the chances are that the policies that are being floated at the moment, what do you think the chances are that they do actually get implemented and put in place? I mean, it's probably going to depend who wins the election, but it sounds like there's a lot of positive noise around improving workers' benefits and working conditions.
Yeah, it's ask me tomorrow and I might have a different answer based on what shows up on my Twitter feed. The challenge is that we keep seeing 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So, for example, 1 step forward being the SEC is now considering specific human capital management metrics and providing more specific guidance on what it requires companies to disclose through their annual financial filings. Not, a knockout by any means, but the fact that it's at least on the dock and it's being legitimately considered, particularly issues around average worker pay, the percentage of full-time employees versus contract workers, diversity and inclusion statistics, definitely a step forward, and couldn't come at a better time when those types of precarious jobs and are very much also the frontline workers. And as Allison was saying, the proportion of those folks who already have environmental, social justice issues facing them, that type of information companies need to be aware of and need to be disclosing. On the other hand, 2 steps back, we just, as you're pointing out, have an administration that is undermining a lot of meaningful progress around social protections, and particularly in healthcare. So you're right, it does come down to what happens in November. We as Ceres are kind of monitoring it and are planning for what the course of action is regardless, but it won't stop our advocacy agenda. I think the continued pressure from investors to realize and show that this is financially material and in their interest to have access to this information, though, will endure regardless of what happens in November. It was great to see even the comptroller for New York City saying, companies who put out a positive support for calls for racial justice and have flashy marketing campaigns, that's excellent. Keep the call to action going, but now also disclose your diversity statistics. Show us where you're actually making a dent where you can in these issues by attracting, retaining, and treating equally people of color. So it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but I think the focus from investors on these issues will remain, and that's the most positive sign.
Yeah, fingers crossed, long may it continue. That does sound really, really positive. Lovely. Okay, I'm going to move to questions now, unless Alistair or Anthony have any last kind of comments you want to make. I'll just have a quick look at the chat. I'll just start at the beginning.
Happy to answer the question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Can the speakers share some practical approaches on how we as investors, the writer is an investor, can measure how well a company is managing human rights? We understand the importance, but solely relying on policies is not much use. Anthony, we could go to you first.
Absolutely. I think there's, and it actually, I think this kind of touches on the second question as well around metrics. There are metrics to use, but in terms of actually doing it right and upholding human rights policies, it does come down to that qualitative information about process. If you're looking at a company's disclosure and they're saying we have these programs in place and these are outcomes, ask them who designed those programs. Ask them who was involved with it. Ask them what stakeholders they spoke to. What was their process for getting there? What are the pieces of evidence that they are showing that their processes are legitimate? It's not going to be a very easily identified number at the top of a page or a graph, but that qualitative information about how they develop their processes really reflects how they've built infrastructure within their business to deal with human rights issues as they come up. We constantly hear from companies the reluctance to disclose or provide more detail around significant human rights violations. And the idea being that if they report more violations, that they're not getting credit for actually having a system to catch the violations. It's just going to send a signal that something's going wrong and that the system's not in place. So I think we do want to move away from that type of discussion and more about, okay, what systems are you putting in place to bring those down? And that's the information that's usually buried pretty deep in sustainability reports. But I think that's what investors need to be looking for, is how are they building the infrastructure to deal with these issues on an ongoing basis? Because the reality is the issues aren't going away anytime soon. So we need to just build systems to handle them and address them and bring meaningful remedy to the people who are affected.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's not the fact that there are those incidences happening, it's how they handle them and put in place better procedures so it doesn't happen to that extent ever again. Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, just one more piece on that too, it just came to me. And also looking for evidence of where the business has actually changed as well. One thing that we've been tracking most recently in the US is the decision by companies to not develop and sell facial recognition technology, right? Like that's a clear outcome example of where companies listened to key stakeholders, they understood the human rights risk, and they said, you know what, we're putting a pause on this. We're not going to develop this. We're not going to move forward with it. That should be a signal to investors that the company is really meaningfully looking at these issues. There's certainly financial implications for taking a product, off the table, but at least that's an outcome of what a meaningful human rights assessment could look like as well. So want to add that in there of examples where companies have said, we know this is a problem and we've decided not to do it. We've decided to change how we've actually developed this product or brought something to market as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, really positive example of investors actually listening. That was really, really great. Alison, don't know if you have anything you'd like to add quickly to. Brilliant. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I certainly do. So we do a lot of work with a network of trustees across the world called the Committee on Workers' Capital. We see workers' capital as workers' money. It's our deferred wages. And so when asset managers hear, oh, here come the unions again, claiming to be the asset owners, we take that very seriously. So our committee developed some guidelines back in 2017 for the evaluation of workers' human rights and labour standards, and that's available to everybody on the website of the Committee on Workers' Capital. And I would just refer to what we mean when we talk about those human rights, because workers' rights are indeed supported in international labour standards as fundamental human rights. And the 4 core labour standards that the International Labour Organization, meaning the standard setting of the world, addresses are freedom of association and collective bargaining. Is there a union in the company? That's kind of a very key question to ask first up. And does that union actually operate? Is it allowed to have meetings? Are they able to actually engage with their members? Is there a feedback mechanism? Does management ever meet them? Does management ever listen to them? Does the engagement with the union result in anything more than result in agreement making, in other words? Are unions genuinely stakeholders? Does the company respect that fundamental human right? So it's union access and freedom of association. Very often companies say to us, but what does freedom of association mean? It's not freedom of speech. It's not freedom to be a member of the Rice Lovers Association of Asia. It's the right to be a member of your workplace or industry union. And that's a fundamental human right. Many people forget that. Secondly, of course, addressing child labor. And it's, there's decades of good practice around that. Not enough yet, but okay. There's thirdly on forced labor. Obviously, trafficking is often associated with the deception around forced labor, but forced labor is much more. And fourthly, discrimination in employment. And that's often related to, in terms of gender, disability, workers' rights for those who've been excluded because they're in the informal economy, migrant workers, and so very often companies say that's all too hard and they reduce it to diversity, how many women are on the board. Well, women on the board, let me say, as a woman, that's important in decision making. But you know what? There's a whole lot of women who need access to healthcare, maternity provisions, other fundamental human rights. So the indicators around human rights are actually quite broad. Human rights is a vast field of study, of research, and of practice. But if we look at this in regards to workplace issues, then it is about work composition. It is about social dialogue, and is that dialogue genuine dialogue? As I say, not just a cup of tea at the end of the day. It's about workforce participation, and often that is also about women returning to work after having children or other care responsibilities. But workforce participation, in many countries, it is still very gendered. In many industries, likewise. In terms of human rights in relation to supply chains, not just corporate headquarters staff, across the scope of the company and operations. Obviously, occupational health and safety. Like, when did companies think that was not going to be a priority? A global pandemic exposes that for what it always has been. Obviously, pay levels, wage rates, gender pay discrimination, etc. And grievance mechanisms. When we talk about mandatory due diligence, it's not only looking at where the risks are, then there's work to be done. And that is about making sure grievance mechanisms are put in place. And I would say all companies need to be at work at that now, not waiting for the legislation or the regulations to change. Getting ahead of the curve, engaging with stakeholders to ensure that mechanisms are in place. And I would say, as an economist, speaking to all those lawyers out there, don't let the lawyers run the show. The lawyers have a very, very narrow concept of what grievance means, and it's all defensive, it's all protectionist. No, we want to ensure that there's ways of addressing the problems before it becomes a legal disaster, or before it becomes a thing that shuts down to an industrial dispute, shuts down the operations of the company. Please look at grievance as a process to ensure greater justice. And those mechanisms have to lead to remedy. Otherwise, it's just fake. It's just superficial. So grievance mechanisms are up there in bright and shining, flashing lights. Please think about that. And I think we want to come to some of the questions about the US, but I want to finish my list. And that is around training and development. You know, investment in training, reskilling, ensuring that the company is ready for the future that's coming at us, and that the workforce is sufficiently prepared. You know, you can't rely on, let's employ a few more millennials, they'll get it, they're adapted, they can adapt. It's very often the people who've been in those workplaces, sounding very ageist, aren't I, for a long time, who understand the processes, how things can change, what needs to be invested in. Please don't throw out the old people and think, you know, throw them on the scrap heap. No, training and development and reskilling is a really important part of a human rights framework, as is my last 2 points, and that is workplace diversity and pension fund contributions for employees. Are companies paying their pension fund contributions? That's what I'm talking about when we talk about social protection. Not only unemployment benefits or sick pay or workers' compensation for when someone is injured or hurt or sick. It's actually about your contributions to the pension funds. This is your industry. If you're not thinking about this long term, oh my goodness, what are we doing? That's my list, Rosie.
No, that was a great list. Thank you, Alison. I'm just, in the interest of time, and we've got 3 more questions, but I wonder if we should have a chat afterwards, the 3 of us, and we'll write the answers and send them out to all the attendees afterwards in written form, so that everyone will get an answer to their question. But I'm just very aware that people probably have lots of places to be now. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much to Alison and Anthony. Just to flag one more time that Alison is actually on holiday, and it's incredibly early for Anthony at the moment, so they're very kind to be making the time to talk to us today. And for me personally, this has been great. So thank you very, very much. We'll put the recording up on the website, as I said. So if anyone wants to watch it back, that's great. But thank you so much, Alison and Anthony, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.